welcome everyone. You are the diehards. You are the ones who braved coming out in the rain. I thank you for doing that. I think you will be rewarded shortly. So Vanessa Davies' early academic training was in Islamic studies. In the early 2000s, though, she had the epiphany, and we're glad she did. She moved backwards in time to ancient Egypt, and this happened via the University of Chicago, where she received her PhD in Egyptology. Her work as an epigrapher at Chicago House, or more formally known as the Epigraphic Survey, in Luxor, Egypt, is indicative of her approach to the ancient Egyptian world in general, because she pays close attention to the intersection between art and texts. Vanessa is currently co-editing a massive tome called the Oxford Handbook of Egyptian Epigraphy and Paleography with Dimitri Labouri of the University of Liège. And I think we're up to, was it 50 articles now? So this will make spectacular reading. She's been a distinguished fellow of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, a Mellon Fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and she's currently a researcher at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at Berkeley. That very important Egyptian collection has direct ties to us here because it was excavated by the very same George Reisner, who later founded the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition. Vanessa is now working on a 3D imaging and paleography project involving scarabs in the collection of the Hearst Museum. And with a new grant she just received from our own White Levy Publications program for archaeological publications, she's facilitating a collaboration between the Hearst Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston here to publish material from George Reisner's excavations at the very important site of Naga Adair. And she recently received yet another grant from the Rockefeller Archive Center in New York for research there on a book which involves some of the material that you'll be hearing about tonight on race and Egyptology in the early 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vanessa Davies.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jane, also, and thank you, Peter, for inviting me to be here today, and thank you to the staff of the Harvard Semitic Museum who have been so welcoming to me. I'm really happy to be here in Boston and here on Harvard's campus. It's been a long time since I was here. The last time I was here, I was in high school. And I came here with my high school for a Model Congress convention. I was in the Supreme Court division, and I was a lawyer arguing that a certain Native American group should be allowed to use peyote in their religious rituals. And so here I am again today on Harvard's campus arguing something else, and that feels really great. So thank you all for coming out today to hear about my research. I'm really excited to talk to you about it here, especially because I feel like here Du Bois's spirit is in the air. I mean, there are so many people here who work on him and his research. There's a wonderful institute here named for him. Of course, he was a student here. So I'm really happy to be here today talking to you about my research, and I appreciate you all coming out on this rainy day for my talk. I've been thinking a long time about the impact that ancient Egypt has on us, and I pay very close attention when I see people, for instance, wearing earrings that are Ankh signs, or wearing a t-shirt with a bust of Nefertiti, or a funerary mask of Tutankhamun, and I drive around the East Bay of California, and I take pictures of murals when I find ancient Egyptian iconography in them. And I think about all of this. I think about how, for many people, ancient Egyptian culture factors into our conceptions of who we are and what our cultural heritage is. And in the US, this often has a racial aspect to it. So I began looking at receptions of ancient Egypt in early 20th century America, and I've uncovered many conversations about ancient Egypt among the scholars and writers of that time. And knowing the connections between W.B. Du Bois and Harvard, I thought this would be an ideal place to talk to you about a set of letters that were exchanged between Du Bois and a British Egyptologist by the name of W.M.F. Petrie, who's also known as Flinders Petrie. And in these letters, they discuss matters relating to race, past and present, and education. These letters are important for understanding the rich and complex history of the discipline of Egyptology, and these letters have important resonances for us today in relation to scientific inquiry, how we address social issues, and in terms of our humanism, recognizing the essential humanity in all people and broadening our perspectives to consider other people's points of view. So first, I want to give you a little bit about each man's background and tell you how they came to know each other, and then we'll discuss the actual correspondence itself. Egyptologists are very familiar with Petrie because he invented the science of archaeology as it's now practiced in Egyptology. He is a giant in our field and in the field of ancient Mediterranean studies in general. Petrie was a prolific author. He wrote many, many scholarly volumes. He wrote an autobiography that was published in 1931, and a student of his wrote a biography of him that came out in 1985. So we know a tremendous amount about Petrie, about his work, about his thoughts, about the things that happened to him in his life, but nowhere in these sources does he mention the letters that I will be talking to you about today. So most Egyptologists are unaware that Petrie and Du Bois had a friendly professional relationship, and that in the first few months of 1912, they exchanged a series of very interesting letters. Petrie was born in London. His first major archaeological work involved surveying and measuring various monuments in England. In 1880, a London-based organization called the Egypt Exploration Fund asked Petrie to go to Giza to measure and map the tombs and pyramids on the Giza Plateau. The Egypt Exploration Fund still operates today out of London. Now they're known as the Egypt Exploration Society. Petrie quickly moved from surveying and measuring to also excavating ancient sites, and his careful methodologies became the basis of a new scientific discipline of Egyptian archaeology, and these included actually excavating material as opposed to just ripping artifacts out of the ground, but also documenting his work, drawing and photographing all of his finds, and publishing the results of his fieldwork. Petrie was unusual among archaeologists of his day because he cared not just for the finely carved and painted statues and stelae that appealed to wealthy donors and to collectors, but Petrie recorded and tracked all finds, so things like ceramic cooking dishes and reed mats and little beads, objects that other researchers would discard. The images you see here are drawings that Petrie published in 1890 from one of his excavations. In the top corner here, where the 18 and 19 are, those are sinkers made of limestone or lead. They would be attached to fishing nets to weigh them down. And then moving across the slide, you have fishing hooks, you have various pins and needles. There are two combs in the center. Those long items are bone needles that would be used for weaving and for making nets, for fishing nets. In the top corner are two spindle whorls. Then, of course, there's a large basket. Over here, you have 3 flints, and along the bottom are various types of pottery. So this is an example, this slide is an example of some of the items of everyday life that Petrie thought was important, that other archaeologists of his day were simply not paying attention to. Petrie felt that histories should be written based on objects like these ones, even if those objects appeared unspectacular to the untrained eye. These histories that Petrie wrote were the histories of non-elite people. These types of people might be represented in wall scenes in elite tomb art. So for instance, you might see a scene of men in a boat catching fish, but not much is said about those men. The image in the elite person's tomb showed only a limited part of the non-elite person's story. But when Petrie excavated, drew, and photographed items like the ones you see here, Petrie could tell much more of their story. He could give more depth and more detail to their histories. Petrie brought a whole new segment of the population more fully into the historical record. Besides advocating for careful scientific excavation, Petrie also developed sequence dating. So using pottery, like the type you see at the bottom of the slide, he developed a system of dating that involved making a stylistic analysis of pottery to construct a relative chronology. His development of scientific method differentiated archaeology from treasure hunting. Now, Petrie did not have much formal schooling. When he was 4, he nearly died from a bronchial infection. A few years later, again in the winter, he became very ill, and his parents decided that he would not leave the house anymore in the wintertime. His health simply couldn't take it. And so this prevented Petrie from attending any sort of formal schooling. He did, however, receive an education just outside of a formal structure. His father taught him the basics of surveying and mapping. His mother and his great aunt had a prolific collection of books, and this provided him with much reading. When he first went to Egypt in 1880, he had done some reading on the ancient culture, but he wasn't overly familiar with it. He learned much more working on site, talking to his colleagues, most of whom were European, and reading their publications. And here is Petrie, that first year that he was working in Egypt in 1880. He's standing outside of a rock-cut tomb that he lived in, and that bit of fluff in the front down here, that's his goat. So he had a fresh supply of milk. So Petrie's scholarly training as an Egyptologist was different from his peers. He taught himself how to read hieroglyphs. We know from a Swiss colleague of his that his translations were apparently maddeningly slow, at least to his Swiss colleague. But, you know, it's okay. Petrie was doing it at his pace. Petrie also didn't know Latin or Greek, as the other scholars of his day did, nor did he know German well. So he had some difficulty translating the work of his colleagues who published in German. All of this put him at a disadvantage in his own field, but Petrie maintained that engineering, as he put it, the mapping and surveying skills that he had, were more useful for an archaeologist than bookwork alone. So keep that in mind, because later on we'll see Petrie talk about bookwork again. Despite his lack of formal education, in 1893, Petrie was appointed a professor at the University of London. A longtime associate of his from the Egypt Exploration Fund, a woman named Amelia Edwards, she was one of the founders of the Egypt Exploration Fund, and she had supported Petrie throughout his career. When she died, she had a fair bit of money and no immediate family. And she had endowed a chair at the University of London in Egyptian archaeology and philology with the express intent that Petrie should be the first person to hold that chair. So with that position, which he assumed in 1893, his future was secure, and he was able to continue his practice of excavating in Egypt in the winters and going back to London in the summers to write up the results of his work and to give lectures. And Petrie had an incredibly long career excavating sites in Egypt. This map is disjointed, and I know you can't read all of the names of the sites, but it starts down here in Nubia, and it works its way north, down the Nile to the Delta, and then east into the Sinai and in Palestine. And I've highlighted in yellow all of the sites that Petrie worked throughout the course of his career. It's nearly 70 different sites over the course of 57 years. Also notable is the scale of work that he directed at these sites. These two images are from Petries Excavations. You can see on the left a large cloud of dust in the air, and under that cloud of dust is a long line of workers. They are turning over the top layer of soil to prepare the ground for the initial excavation, which will happen next. In the picture on the right, there's a pit down below, down here, and that's where the excavation is happening. And when a bucket is filled with sand and dirt, it is passed person by person up the cliff, 41 feet up the cliff, to then dump it out at the top because there's no room to dump it down below. So these images give you a sense of the scale of work that Petrie directed on his excavations. And Petrie cared first and foremost about this, about the work of archaeology. From these images, you can see that he directed that work on a huge scale, employing large numbers of the local population, mostly boys in their teens, but sometimes also girls and sometimes older men as well. And Petrie cared for the Egyptians who worked for him, but he cared for them from the point of view of his work. He tried to give those who labored for him protection in the sense of their work. So, for example, protection from overseers who might demand a cut of their wages, protection from looters who might try to tempt them to turn over artifacts to them rather than to turn the artifacts into Petrie, and to protect them from each other, from theft and quarreling amongst the other laborers. Petrie approached the hiring, training, and oversight of his workers from a rather practical perspective, but it's a perspective tinged by the views of the colonialist imperialist era in which he lived. He credited well-trained workers with having wisdom and important observations about the work at hand. He described them as personal friends, but then wrote that they, quote, are regarded much as old servants in a good household. His views on Egyptians could not escape the fact that these people worked for him and he compensated them. They were paid laborers. This is one of the main lenses through which he views Egyptians. Another major factor that influenced Petrie's perspective on modern Egyptians was that Petrie subscribed to the theory of eugenics, and for a period of time he worked closely with Francis Galton. The influence of Galton's theory on Petrie's Egyptological research can be seen, for example, in Petrie's idea that a European race migrated to prehistoric Egypt, conquered the local people there, and began Egyptian history as we know it. This idea has been discredited within Egyptology, but in Petrie's day, the idea was given some credence, and Petrie was a proponent of it. So the three factors that come to bear strongly on the ideas that Petrie discusses in his letters with Du Bois are the theory of eugenics and Petrie's ideas about ancestry, Petrie's work in Egypt, which required a lot of workers, and finally, Petrie's own educational experiences, which is to say, his lack of formal schooling and his subsequent successful career as an archaeologist and as a professor. And now Du Bois. Du Bois had a liberal arts style of education at Fisk University and at Harvard. He had a completely different perspective on education than Petrie did. Du Bois had been exposed to many disciplines and to different approaches to both asking and solving questions. Petrie left England in his late 20s to work in Egypt and lived and worked there for many years. Du Bois also had a culturally immersive experience, but his was in Germany, where he lived and studied from 1892 to 1894. There, Du Bois lived a life devoid of the racial prejudices and racial discriminations that he experienced in the US. He was treated by Germans in ways radically different from what he had become accustomed to in the US, and that distance, both physically and culturally, led him to see the US in a new light. In Germany, he was influenced by the detailed scientific research of his professors, people like the economists Gustav Schmoller and Adolf Wagner, who devised and recommended solutions for social problems based on statistical analysis, the accumulation of historical and contemporary facts, and questions of ethics. So let me tell you how these two men crossed paths. Early in Du Bois's career, he had an idea to put together an Encyclopedia Africana. This would be a kind of companion or counterpoint to the Encyclopedia Britannica. His plan was to assemble an editorial board and an advisory board. And when we look at a copy of the letterhead for the Encyclopedia Africana, who do we find as the second name on the board of advisors but Flinders Petrie? Du Bois had secured the assistance of Petrie on the Encyclopedia Project in 1909. In the last week of July 1911, Du Bois attended a conference at the University of London called the Universal Races Congress. The Universal Races Congress was intended to encourage understanding, friendship, and cooperation between people of the East and people of the West, or as the organizers wrote, the quote, so-called white and so-called colored peoples. The organizers of the Congress wanted to facilitate universal peace by pointing out ideas such as anti-miscegenation that were based on faulty science, and by challenging what they called the inertia of the uninformed human mind. I've assembled images of some of the speakers here so you can get a sense of who attended this conference. Starting at the top left, you have people from Haiti and China. The third man in the top row here is Gustav Spiller. He was one of the organizers of the Congress. There are two women on this slide. There were actually more than two women who spoke on the Congress, but only two made it to my slide. We have Sister Nivedita here, who was a social worker and author living in India, and here Dr. Carolyn Reese-Davids, who is a specialist in Buddhist studies. You have Franz Boas up here next to a man from South Africa. You have these two gentlemen who I put side by side, one from India, one from Germany, and I just thought they looked so identical to each other with their long beards. So you have people from Turkey, Japan, France, Russia, Egypt, Brazil, India, Persia, and of course, Du Bois. Du Bois gave a talk at the Congress entitled The Negro Race in the United States of America, which summarized the history, demographics, and social issues of people of African descent in the US. Petrie did not give a talk at the Congress, nor was he listed among the supporters of the Congress, which did include a few Egyptologists, and also included, I should note, F.W. Putnam of the Peabody Museum. So Petrie was not on that list, nor did he give a talk, but he must have attended the Congress. Years later, Du Bois wrote a letter to a professor at Fisk recounting that he had discussed the encyclopedia in 1911 with Petrie and with others at the Congress in London. And it makes sense that Petrie would be at the Congress. He was, after all, a professor at the University of London, and the Congress happened in July when Petrie would have been in England, not excavating in Egypt. So when they met in July 1911, Du Bois must have told Petrie about, or maybe even given him a copy, of his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk. In November, Petrie left England to begin a season of archaeological work in Egypt. Soon after he arrived, he was bothered by recurring pain, and he went to a doctor and found out that he was going to need a hernia operation. This, of course, interrupted his archaeological season, but the subsequent convalescence gave him some unexpected time for reading. It was at that time that he read Du Bois's book, and in January 1912, while still recovering from surgery, Petrie initiated with Du Bois a conversation about race and education that would address contemporary life in the US and in Egypt. Petrie wrote Du Bois a letter on January 3rd, 1912. The letter begins with his appreciation for Du Bois's book because Petrie wrote, he has, quote, long wanted to grasp the Negro problem, and your prudent, balanced statement is very helpful. Petrie went on to explain his point of view as an archaeologist and a historian, as an Englishman who had been living and working in Egypt by that time for over 3 decades. Petrie used Du Bois's metaphor of the veil to discuss the difference between, as he put it, the native and the English. Petrie reported that despite dramatic differences in the social realities in the US and Egypt, namely that there was no recent history of slavery in Egypt like there was in the US, and that there was no discrimination in Egypt based on skin color, or at least none that was visible to Petrie, he wrote that there was, in his experience, still very little social interaction in Egypt between educated Egyptians and educated Europeans. And in addition, Petrie knew of only 3 marriages between an English person and an Egyptian person. So Petrie posed to Du Bois the question, how could the US achieve an integrated society when a place like Egypt cannot, even though Egypt lacks the complex social factors that are present in the US? Petrie wrote that he himself is not so inclined, but his conclusion, which again borrowed Du Bois's metaphor, was that, quote, the English race all over the world insists on the veil. So to illustrate for Du Bois the presence of the veil in Egypt, Petrie explained in his letter what he called the Englishman's objections to the native. Petrie stereotyped Egyptians as dishonest cheats and informed Du Bois that he adopted a strict disciplinarian attitude towards his workers at work and then was more friendly to them outside of work. Regarding education, he noted that it was more likely to cause damage than to benefit Egyptians. He wrote, education of book and memory sort is an injury in most cases. It depends on ancestry. The Arab is generally spoiled by it. The Copt, that is Coptic Christian, with 100 generations of literary ancestors, is generally benefited. I should say that some technical and trade teaching and hygiene would benefit all. Not more than 5% would be the better for reading and writing, just to supply the minor official staff, but no useless subjects should be taught. Not more than 1 in 1,000 would really benefit by higher education. To give more only produces a moral deterioration. And the letter goes on, touching on a few different issues, and Petrie restated his position that, quote, education in the formal lines will no more clear the Negro problem in the US than freedom or voting. At the end of February 1912, Du Bois wrote a strongly worded response to Petrie. He expressed his regret that Petrie countered dishonesty among his workers with an authoritarian attitude, and he argued that denying people an education does nothing to combat such issues, but only inhibits personal development. Du Bois informed Petrie that the viewpoints he described, denying Egyptians an education based on the idea that they somehow can't handle it, that it somehow would cause them more harm than good, those views were quite similar, Du Bois wrote, to his own experience. People who held opinions similar to Petrie's had discouraged Du Bois's parents from educating him. He wrote, if your ideas had been carried out in the United States, and there are many people trying to carry them out, I should not be having the pleasure of communicating with you now. On the contrary, I should probably be the victim of that manner which you used to your underlings in Egypt. Du Bois then addressed each of Petrie's major points about education and about the situation in the US. Du Bois asked for Petrie's permission to publish these letters, which Petrie subsequently gave. By the time that Petrie would have received this letter of Du Bois's in March of 1912, he had recovered from the hernia operation and he was back at work in Egypt. Despite facing the demands of being back in the field, Petrie felt it imperative to respond quickly to Du Bois's letter. In a letter dated March 20th, 1912, Petrie wrote of his desire to assure Du Bois that he did not agree with the European attitude towards other races that he had outlined in his first letter, nor was he defending it. He intended, he wrote, to illustrate for Du Bois that the ill will of Europeans towards other races was directed at all other races and was not just, as he put it, anti-Negro. And he really meant that comment to make Du Bois feel better. Petrie clarified for Du Bois that he did not desire to deny people an education, but he thought that the education should be fairly divided between hard work and book work. Here, Petrie makes a distinction between hard work, by which he means work involving physical labor, and book work, which he evidently does not consider to be very difficult. Petrie further explained his position regarding education and politics. His desire to not provoke Du Bois again on the subject of education can be seen in his caveat that his opinions applied to contemporary England, but he would not claim that they applied to the US. So at that time, in 1912, Du Bois was the editor of The Crisis, the magazine of the NAACP. Petrie had given him permission to publish their correspondence, and in the May 1912 issue of the Crisis, the letters appeared under the title, Self-Righteous Europe and the World. Correspondence with Flinders Petrie. The string of abbreviations after Petrie's name stand for Doctor of Civil Law, Doctor of Letters, Doctor of Laws, and Fellow of the Royal Society. They look like a slew of earned degrees, but those are honorary degrees. Why are they here? There are many reactions that readers might have to this. In a reader's mind, this list of degrees might lend more authority to Petrie's voice. Or perhaps it would read as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek move, drawing attention to a kind of disconnect between the narrow scientific world that Petrie inhabited and the larger worldview that Du Bois discussed with him. A reader might see those degrees as representative of different value systems, a focus on titles and academic honor versus a focus on humans. The first two letters were reproduced in their entireties with only a small portion of the third letter. The correspondence is published without commentary or explanation except for this title that you see. So 3 of the factors that I identified in Petrie's letters are his eugenic ideas about ancestry, his focus on archaeological work in Egypt, and his own educational experiences. Petrie's espousal of a eugenic theory can be seen in his letter to Du Bois when he wrote that education of book and memory is an injury in most cases, and then he elaborated, it depends on ancestry. The Arab is generally spoiled by it, the Copt is generally benefited. So here Petrie's making a distinction based on religion. By Arab, he means Muslim, since he's contrasting that with a Coptic Christian. And so he favors the ancestry of Coptic Christians, and thus their abilities to benefit from education over that of Muslims. Petrie's viewpoint that ancestry determines life oversimplifies the realities of life, such as wealth and status differentials and the resultant access or inaccess to resources of all types, and it ignores things like human resourcefulness, creativity, and enthusiasm. But Petrie applied a view of genetic determinism to himself as well. I mean, knowing his background, we might view Petrie's great success as an Egyptologist as due to a variety of factors. The fact that his parents could afford to own books, enabling him to read. The fact that his father had leisure time and could set up scientific experiments for his son. The fact that his mother was educated and could help him with his education. And Petrie's own determination in pursuing the subjects that appealed to him, not to mention the fact that a wealthy benefactor with no husband or children had endowed a position specifically for him at the University of London. Petrie, however, had a different view of the matter. In line with the theory of eugenics that he subscribed to, he wrote in his autobiography that his success in work was due to his heritage, because he had been born with all of the talents that led to his accomplishments. Petrie's oversimplifications due to his eugenic viewpoint gave him an excuse for not advocating for the broader education of the workers who supplied the very material on which he based his career. From his perspective as their employer, Petrie did not see a book-based education of his laborers as a useful effort. He taught them what they needed to know in the field, and the ones who showed skill and honesty would be hired again the following season. And I should note here that Petrie's attitude towards training his workers is similar to the way that he educated his own graduate students, primarily in the field. The formal education for Egyptology students at the University of London wasn't developed until 1913, the year after he was writing to Du Bois. In his letters to Du Bois in 1912, it didn't even occur to Petrie that the Egyptians who worked for him might have reasons to gain knowledge other than to work for him. Unlike Du Bois, who considered broader social and cultural needs, Petrie considered the education of Egyptians only as it related to his own work needs, and he showed a striking lack of imagination for what might be done with an education. In The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois explained the purpose of the university, that it was to give a broad, multifaceted perspective on life. He wrote, "The function of the university is not simply to teach breadwinning, but to show students realities of life that are different from the ones that they grew up with, to help them see points of views other than the ones that they brought to university." Du Bois was completely opposed to opinions like the ones that Petrie outlined. In Du Bois's view, it's fine for the university to teach wage-earning skills, but the result of university training, He writes, "The final product of our training must be neither a psychologist nor a brick mason, but a person. And to make people, we must have ideals, broad, pure, and inspiring ends of living, not sordid money-getting." Du Bois's vision of education and of broadening one's perspective was in line with the German concept of Bildung. So here again, his graduate education in Germany and Petrie's lack of exposure to such concepts played a role. Petrie created workers with the field training that he devised. Du Bois wanted to create people. Du Bois's concern for people, for humanity, prompted Roland Rabaka to call Du Bois a radical humanist, someone who works with all people to achieve racial, gender, economic, and social justice for all people. Sure, Du Bois thought it was important to teach people how to make money. He was a realist and he knew people needed money to survive. But what he really stressed, what he cared the most about, was that the university helped people to achieve a concern for other humans, to help people to contextualize their backgrounds and to understand their fellow humans. It was an education of empathy and unity that trained people to think outside of their own needs and fears and regrets and to think about the good of humanity. Petrie and Du Bois both operated within the scientific method of their day, which involved, for example, ideas about the blood of various racial types and different physical features as being characteristic of these quote-unquote racial types. With Petrie, we see this in his careful measurement that he made of the skulls of Egyptian mummies. He tracked sizes and shape differences, and he used those to make assumptions about social and racial characteristics of people. He identified what he referred to as racial types in ancient Egyptian depictions, which were just stereotypical images of different humans, but he studied them, he took photographs of them, he made plaster casts of them. Du Bois did not subscribe to these eugenic theories, but he was influenced by the scientific discourse of his day. If we carefully parse Du Bois's statement in The Souls of Black Folk about the purpose of the university, we see that it contains vocabulary reminiscent of a eugenic viewpoint. He wrote that universities must make people, and to make people, we must have ideals. Those ideals he defined as broad, pure, and inspiring ends of living. Now, Du Bois didn't mean pure from the standpoint of genetic purity, but this is the word that occurred to him, a word that was floating around in the science of his day, a word that resonated with discussions of race and eugenics. This is a good example of the innocence and power of words. Du Bois used purity here in a positive way, but this word has a latent power. In someone else's hands, this language of purity might be wielded like a weapon. It might become less innocent, more dangerous. But I have another example for you. The focus on physical features that dominated some of Petrie's work can also be seen in the crisis. This is a masthead of the crisis that was adopted in November 1911. So just when Petrie was leaving England for Egypt, only to be shortly interrupted by the unexpected hernia operation, this new visual element appeared on the front cover. It is clearly an Egyptianizing image, and it's based on the ancient depiction of the winged sun disk, which you see at the bottom. This new masthead substituted the sun disk with an image that would be more meaningful to readers, the head of a king, as identified by the false beard and the headdress that he wears. And look, by focusing on physical features in the same way that Petrie did, this image assigns the king a black identity. The closely drawn vertical lines on the king's face and neck give his skin a darker shade than the surrounding images, like the feathers with their internal white space. The crisis was billed as the record of the darker races, and this king is clearly of a darker race. There's a lot going on in this image that relates to the science and to the history of Du Bois's day. This new cover image reflected the interest of Du Bois in the history of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia. As Wilson Jeremiah Moses of Penn State put it, Du Bois's interest in ancient Egypt stemmed from Du Bois's recognition that the ancient culture was one of power and authority, and that's what we're seeing here, power and authority. Who embodies power and authority? The king. And who is that king? The king is shown through his physical features to be a black man. This image expressed Du Bois's view that these ancient people of Egypt and Nubia were of African descent, and that people of African descent had a lineage of power. This image is representative of Du Bois's efforts to write histories of Africa, to write histories about people who at that time, in Du Bois's day, were being told that they had no history, that Africa had no history. But there's more. Even the type of image chosen reflects Du Bois's scientific training. In searching for a masthead that would connect the ancient cultures of Egypt and Nubia with people of African descent in America, Du Bois didn't pick a romantic watercolor, he didn't pick a photograph. Du Bois bolstered his image of power and authority in the hands of an African king by depicting it in a scientific drawing, an epigraphic line drawing, one dark color on a light background. This is a type of scientific recording of ancient decoration that by 1911 had been practiced for over a century by scholars and travelers who went up and down the Nile recording the decoration in ancient tombs and temples. And these scientific epigraphic line drawings have a special place at Harvard with Peter Manuelian, who is a pioneer in Egyptology in the field of digital epigraphy. Besides operating within the constraints of the scientific world of their day, there was something else that Du Bois and Petries shared and that was central to both of their personalities. They were activists. In the tradition of his German professors, who sought to address the social problems of their communities, Du Bois used his scientific training to address the problems of race relations in the US. Petrie used the scientific method that he devised to address problems with the archaeological practice of his day. In a piece he wrote on the ethics of archaeology, Petrie cataloged behaviors that he described as a crime, a failing, and an inexcusable malpractice, and these included not making maps while excavating and not publishing one's fieldwork. He railed against damage that was being done to the decorated wall scenes, sites that were just dug up and not properly conserved, artifacts that were left to decay in museums without being preserved, and museum displays that were not properly organized and not labeled. He argued the government should enact laws to protect the integrity of sites and to deter the illicit theft and sale of antiquities. But within this ethical framework, Petrie nowhere mentioned the rights of archaeological laborers. In his zeal to protect the ancient past of Egypt, he neglected the very workers who aided him in his work. Petrie's activism for a scientific archaeological method contrasted sharply with Du Bois's use of a scientific method to be an activist for humans. That's the overarching difference that separates the worldviews of Petrie and Du Bois, their focus. Archaeology in the case of Petrie, other human beings in the case of Du Bois. Their diverging outlooks are clearly demonstrated when they speak of the importance of history. For Petrie, the growing interest in history and archaeology, as distinguished from treasure hunting, signaled that humans had reached the pinnacle of development. In his formulation, humans first showed an interest in each other, then an interest in animals, and finally, by his day, he perceived that humans had achieved the highest point, an interest in the past. Petrie was quite complacent about the world as it was in his day. You can tell that he was comfortable in his life. You can tell that he was a member of the dominant culture group. He doesn't express concerns about anything related to the functioning of the societies that he lived and worked in. His was an imperialistic vision of history expressed in evolutionary terms. Du Bois's attitude towards history in these early decades of the 20th century was quite different. He wrote the histories of Africa and of people of African descent with an urgency. Historiography was about communicating knowledge, yes, but for Du Bois it was also empowering, both personally, on a psycho-emotional level, and politically. Du Bois was fighting against those who claimed that Africans had no history. In contradiction to that theory, Du Bois wrote about Africa as a locus from which many histories are launched. In the case of ancient Egypt, he discussed its influence not as the usual Western story of reception through ancient Greek and Roman cultures, but rather the ancient Egyptian people as connecting the people of Asia and other people in Africa, and Egypt as a connector zone between those two areas. Du Bois's innovative perspective on ancient Egypt is analogous to Petrie's radically new consideration of the detritus of daily life. At a time when archaeologists did not value the items of everyday life, things like pottery and reed mats, Petrie used them to construct new views of history, something beyond and different from the histories that are recounted in the carved and painted texts and art of the elite. Du Bois also constructed new views of history, something different from the culturally dominant white historical perspective in the West. And where Petrie saw an interest in the past as important for the lives of the dead people who are studied, because scholars make them live again, Du Bois saw interest in the past as important for living people. Knowledge of the history of people of African descent, their contributions to world culture, their stories, their sense of longevity in the world, this would give people of African descent in America a new perspective on their lives. They could see that their contemporary living conditions were just one way of living and that there were other possibilities, other lives that people of African descent had lived. Du Bois researched and wrote new visions of African history to provide people of African descent with hope for the present, because the past had potency in the present. The past gave authority, purpose, and strength to those in the present because it could give people a new perspective on themselves and on the world. Du Bois was a proponent of a liberal arts style of education because he knew that this was an effective way of seeing life from perspectives other than your own. Du Bois and others of his era pushed for the recognition of the historical and current contributions that people of African descent made and were making in the world. Because people of African descent were being pushed to the side, they were being marginalized by some scientists, by some historians, and by some Egyptologists. And so scholars like Du Bois looked to Egyptology and to the leading Egyptologists of their day to concur with some opinions and to dissent from others. Scholars like Du Bois fought back. They fought back against claims that the people of African descent had no history and that the history of Egypt was not a part of African history but was a part of white history. They fought back and they won. Those claims have been debunked. But more needs to be done. It's vital that we understand the complexity and the diversity of the history of Egyptology as an academic discipline. We need to rediscover and remember stories like the ones I've talked about today, and we need to incorporate those into our histories of Egyptology. Magan Keita of Villanova wrote about a kind of academic gatekeeping, or as he put it, who has the right, who is privileged to participate in the construction of both history and knowledge. I'm here to say that it is imperative that when we think of the history of Egyptology, when we think of people like Flinders Petrie and George Reisner of Harvard, James Henry Breasted of the University of Chicago, we should also include with these individuals scholars like W.B. Du Bois, who challenged the dominant discourse of their day and who provided correctives to erroneous views that Egyptologists held. It took some time for their alternative perspectives to be accepted within Egyptology, but these are correctives that are now taken seriously and that forever changed the way that the history of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia is understood. As someone who studies ancient Egyptian wall decoration, I understand and agree with Petries' concerns regarding the preservation of ancient monuments and the detailed publication and presentation of that information to the public. I'm also a huge proponent of a liberal arts style of education in the tradition of the arguments made by Du Bois, and I think here at Harvard I probably don't have to do much convincing of you of the importance of a liberal arts style of education. I'd like to use the correspondence between Du Bois and Petrie as a way to reiterate the importance of the humanities and to stress how important it is to join humanistic and scientific lines of inquiry in the way that the German idea of Wissenschaft encompasses all areas of systematic research. Because one way to combat irrational and fear-based schemes that are pretending to be science, that are masquerading as science, and that show a lack of concern for other humans, is to marry scientific method and humanistic thought. Henry Louis Gates Jr. recognized this years ago. He talked about it in an article in 2007, which he may not even remember, but he was interviewed for it in the Boston Globe. The article was about scientists' growing abilities to pinpoint physical traits in the genetic code. Gates talked about, quote, walking a fine line between using biology and allowing it to be abused. And in that situation, you had a lot of scientists who were well-meaning in their intentions and who are aware that their growing body of knowledge could, if it lands in the hands of misguided people, lead to some incredibly wrong-headed, distasteful, and dangerous ideas. That's the importance of marrying scientific and humanistic inquiry. In these images, we see the passions of Petrie and of Du Bois. We see their activism for the causes that inspired them, and we also see the stark contrast between the focus of their causes. On the right is Petrie, nearly 70 years old, marching across the desert, long staff in hand, off to inspect an archaeological site. And on the left is Du Bois, in a line of men dressed in suits, marching peacefully down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, calling for an end to the deaths of people of African descent by lynching. Du Bois advocated for a focus on the good of our fellow human beings. He used scientific method to address and devise answers to the social problems of his day, and he paired scientific and humanistic inquiry. That is the lesson of his correspondence with Petrie. Du Bois knew that understanding people is hard work. He knew that it requires training, a broadening of perspective, learning other ways of viewing the world, and then learning how to assess one's own view in light of those views. When we make it a focus to train people in humanistic inquiry, and when we demand that humanistic inquiry be paired with scientific and technological inquiry, then we will be on the road to making people in a Du Boisian tradition. That is the work of education. That is how we defend against what the organizers of the Universal Races Congress called faulty science and the inertia of the uninformed human mind. That is how we defend against fear, and that is how we learn to develop what Du Bois called ideals, broad and inspiring ends of living. Thank you.